After months of leaked reports and allegations about foreign interference in Canada's democracy, a long-awaited decision came down today, and it wasn't the result opposition parties wanted. Special Rapporteur David Johnston ruled out a public inquiry. Instead, Johnston said he will hold public hearings on the policy issues he's identified so far. Johnston said he found no evidence the Prime Minister or ministers ignored intelligence or recommendations. But he did identify what he called serious shortcomings in the way security agencies share and communicate intelligence. He also takes apart some of the reporting on foreign interference, saying leaked materials were misconstrued in some media reports. He's now calling on a committee of MPs, NSICOP, and the Intelligence Review Committee and CIRA to review his conclusions and tell the public if they disagree with his findings. Joining us now is Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Dominic LeBlanc. He's in London. Minister, thanks for making the time.
Thank you, David. Good evening.
David Johnston recommended against a public inquiry. Do you think Canadians will accept that recommendation as easily as the Prime Minister did?
David, we've said from the beginning that Mr. Johnston was a nonpartisan, thoughtful, experienced public servant who had access to all of the intelligence information, including the most classified intelligence reports, who interviewed heads of the intelligence agencies, all of the relevant officials, a number of ministers. I was interviewed by Mr. Johnston, so was the Prime Minister. He's come to this conclusion after a thoughtful and thorough analysis. And it's not, by the way, a different conclusion than the former Conservative campaign director, Fred Delory, came to when he said that a public inquiry might offer interesting political theater, but because of the very nature of the information that's contained in these documents and these reports, it can't be a public inquiry in the traditional sense of the term. We think the National Security Committee of Parliamentarians that represents all political parties, we think that the opposition party leaders who will be given security cleared to receive this most sensitive information can themselves come to the conclusion if Mr. Johnston's recommendations are reasonable. These are ways that Canadians can be, we think, reassured that all of the appropriate steps are in place to strengthen our democratic institutions. And we think Mr. Johnston explained very well, and himself, why this is the case.
But, you know, it hasn't reassured all of the opposition parties. They are united in their demand for a public inquiry. There's a Leger poll in March that said 72% of Canadians are in favor of an independent public inquiry. So is this position tenable with public sentiment and the political mood on this?
Well, first of all, Mr. Poilievre has been unreasonable and behaved like a political vandal since this issue emerged. He refused to meet with Mr. Johnston. The other party leaders met with Mr. Johnston. Mr. Poilievre, David, was Minister of Democratic Institutions, a position that I currently hold, and he did absolutely nothing about this in the Harper Conservative government when CSIS had publicly identified this as a challenge 10 years ago when Poilievre was minister. So our government has consistently taken a series of measures to strengthen the resiliency of our democratic institutions, prepare us as a government and as a society to counter the evolving threat of foreign interference. This is not something that a conversation that we've come to recently. We've been at this for a number of years. We accept Mr. Johnston's recommendations also that the government can further strengthen measures that are in place, can better share intelligence information. I'm in London today, David, because I met Tom Tugendhat, who is himself the minister responsible for strengthening democratic institutions in the United Kingdom. We talked about measures that the UK has put in place, their allies obviously in the intelligence work. They're facing many of the same challenges that Canada is, and it's important for us to strengthen these institutions as best as we can.
But it's not just Mr. Poilievre. Mr. Singh says he's going to use every tool he has available to try to convince the Prime Minister to hold a public inquiry into this. And while he does not quarrel with David Johnston's credibility or his reputation, he makes the point that having this done independently by a judge like Justice Rouleau did with the Emergencies Act inquiry will reassure Canadians and rebuild trust beyond simply saying, just trust us with this report without that public oversight function. So why is I understand why you think Mr. Poilievre is wrong. Why is Mr. Singh wrong?
Well, but to use the example of the Rouleau Commission, David, the Rouleau Commission was able to have witnesses representing a series of different perspectives, examined on live television, cross-examined by lawyers, sworn in to publicly talk about information they had. The very nature of this sensitive intelligence information, some of which would come from Canada's allies and other intelligence agencies, cannot be disclosed in a live television. As much as we want to watch a news world, you're not going to have intelligence agencies by law able to answer some questions. And Mr. Johnston, we think, correctly identified the frustration that would then be built in. Mr. Poilievre would then say, well, it's not actually a public inquiry at all because you're not having a televised hearing where a particular intelligence agency is going to reveal what necessarily have to be classified documents. We think that there are other ways to reassure Canadians that the government is taking this issue seriously, that the elections, as Mr. Johnston said, as a panel of senior public servants has said publicly, as the head of the intelligence agencies have said publicly, the 2019 and 2021 elections, 3 independent reviews have confirmed that they were free and democratic, that the decisions made were the decisions of Canadians in those elections. So if the opposition leaders want to see access, want to see this sensitive information, we're going to make it available to them. And we think that a committee of parliamentarians, for example, is also in a position to validate the conclusions that Mr. Johnston shared with Canadians today.
But, you know, the Prime Minister himself spoke about the need to restore trust in the wake of all of this, because this whole episode has undermined Canadians' trust in elections and in how democracy functions here in this country. Is this report enough to restore that confidence, in your view? It's 55 pages of reassurance, right? Because you can't show the primary information. Is this enough in the absence of a public inquiry?
Well, but this isn't the end of the story. Mr. Johnston will conduct himself public hearings to share with Canadians and particularly diaspora communities the importance of being prepared to counter foreign intelligence. He'll develop policy recommendations for the government. There will be another report this fall. The National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians will issue a report. So will the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. So this isn't the end of the story. And our government hasn't also finished, David, putting in place all of the necessary measures to detect and counter foreign interference and to help build resiliency amongst Canadians, amongst parliamentarians, members of parliament and senators. These briefings are taking place. So no, it's certainly not the end of our work to reassure Canadians. And there are a number of steps over the coming weeks and months that we think will contribute to reassuring Canadians that the government is very much on top of this circumstance, that we will make the changes that are required to ensure that our position evolves as does the threat. We think taken together, all of these things can reassure Canadians.
Pages 18 and 19 of David Johnston's report paint a pretty brutal picture of how intelligence in the country is shared and consumed and communicated within government itself. And while he clears the government of any political failures in this, the systemic and structural ones are outlined there pretty starkly, about binders full of information going into departments with no clear idea of who is reading them, no clear records who has actually seen intelligence assessments, and then the way senior staffers are briefed, they're kind of left to choose their own adventure in a large binder of information with no guidance from security officials. What are you going to do to fix that, Minister?
Well, so we accept that is something that's an unacceptable circumstance. The Prime Minister has said that repeatedly. The Public Safety Minister has said it. We've issued new directives to the security agencies in the last couple of weeks. The Prime Minister has convened a number of meetings, some of which I was present at, where he's made it clear to the intelligence agencies, as has the clerk of the Privy Council. So this is being rectified. We accept Mr. Johnston's conclusions that this circumstance is unacceptable. The good news, David, is it's being corrected and has been corrected. And going forward, those examples that Mr. Johnston properly identified will not happen again.
How is it, though, that after the 2016 U.S. election, where foreign interference was a big topic, after the arbitrary detention of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig and all of the issues in terms of dealing with China, that this sort of dysfunction persists in the sharing of intelligence within a G7 country?
So again, those are exactly the kind of questions the Prime Minister has asked the senior officials. His national security advisor has made it clear in conversations where I've been present that those are failings, or those are unacceptable circumstances that have to be corrected and have been corrected. It's not politicians that direct intelligence agencies in terms of how they conduct their practices according to Canadian law, but it is unacceptable in a circumstance where parliamentarians themselves, for example, have been targeted, that the senior political leadership of the government wasn't made aware and wasn't able to provide the appropriate information to those parliamentarians to build their own defenses. That work is being done and has been done, but we accept that that's a legitimate criticism, and the government's taken its responsibility to fix it.
You're in London. I know we have NSI COP, which is similar but not exactly the way it functions in the United Kingdom. Do you think we need a total overhaul of Parliament's role in assessing intelligence to have a more robust system like our allies have in the city you're in at this point?
We think we can continue to evolve our measures. We look forward to Mr. Johnston's recommendations to some extent in this regard later in October. My conversations with the British minister today talked a lot about statutory changes, legislative changes they've made around creating criminal and quasi-criminal offenses in this space. So that's the work that the Public Safety Minister and the Justice Minister are doing. The Foreign Agent Registry was also part of the conversation. That's also work that we're doing. We think we can learn a lot from allies, and that was very much the work I did this afternoon here in London.
Okay, Dominic LeBlanc, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, David. Have a good evening.
We wanted to have confidence in the entire process in order to fix the interference problem. We wanted a public, independent inquiry. That's what we wanted. What Mr. Johnston offered us is not public, it's not independent.
Now, the NDP has also called for a public inquiry, but now that one has been ruled out, where does that leave the New Democrats? Jagmeet Singh is the leader of the NDP. He's in Nanaimo, British Columbia. Mr. Singh, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You've disagreed with David Johnston's decision not to recommend a public inquiry. How much pressure will you put on the Prime Minister to overrule his special rapporteur? Because right now the Prime Minister says he's going to abide by that recommendation.
Well, I'm going to make this clear in the next meeting I have with the Prime Minister. I'm going to sit down with the Prime Minister and let him know that I believe a public inquiry is still necessary, and I'll be using all the tools that I have at my disposal to make sure we continue to push for one. The reason being is there have been a lot of allegations, a lot of concerns raised, and Canadians will have more confidence in our electoral system with the rigor of a public inquiry where there are multiple questions asked from multiple lawyers and others of multiple witnesses. Witnesses are compelled to appear, and a judge, an independent judge, assesses what information can be disclosed publicly and what has to remain confidential for national security. That process in and of itself has the rigor that will give Canadians more confidence, because I want people to believe that they can vote and their vote will make a difference.
You say we'll use all the tools. One of those tools, presumably, is the confidence and supply agreement. Will you use that tool to get a public inquiry?
That's not a decision we're making today, but there are a number of other tools, like we've done in the past, where we forced a vote on a public inquiry in the House of Commons, in the chamber itself. That's something that New Democrats did. That's an example of a tool that we have. We'll look at other tools and we will use the ones that we can to force this to move forward.
But that didn't lead to one. That vote happened. It's symbolic. It's not binding on the government. I know you can voice your objections and use Parliament to sort of shame them, but that has no weight. That you're the only leader with actual leverage, right? With the confidence and supply agreement. So I'm wondering why you won't use it if this is so important to the basic underpinnings of our democracy.
It is very important, and that's why we're going to be pushing for solutions. We want to see Mr. Johnston's work continue. That work is important. It did uncover some key findings. The fact that the government was aware of irregularities, for example, in Hang Dong's nomination, but because CSIS didn't provide any course of action, they chose to do nothing. That, to me, is a serious red flag. Why would the government, after hearing information of irregularities, not have a follow-up, not look at improving the process, not look at maybe having their own course of action to remedy the problem? That is something that was uncovered by Mr. Johnston, which was helpful. So his work should continue. I think that's important work. I also believe strongly that a public inquiry is still important, and we'll push for that. There are other tools that we have, and we'll be providing those updates around what we'll be doing next to continue to push for it.
What other tool? I mean, a vote in Parliament is one thing. Voicing your objection to the Prime Minister in your next meeting is another. But if I again see the only obvious way to try to force Justin Trudeau to do something he doesn't want to do is the confidence and supply agreement. I mean, what other tool can be as effective as that?
We'll be providing you with details, the media with details when we make those next steps. But there's other tools, and we'll be using those tools.
Okay, but like, I guess I'm hung up on all the tools in the toolbox, right? I've got a hammer, a socket set, a wrench, a drill, a screwdriver. You know, you have the hammer that you can swing with the confidence and supply agreement. I mean, other than a meeting with him, what is the next thing New Democrats are going to do to try to force the Prime Minister to change his path?
Well, like I said, that's not a decision we're making today around the confidence and the supply agreement, but there are other tools, and as soon as we are going to decide on which one we're going to use next, we'll let you know. But we want to make it very clear that we'll be letting the Prime Minister know, I disagree with the decision. I think it's a wrong decision, given the stakes here and how important it is for us to be able to have better accountability, given the fact that the government hasn't been taking this seriously, that I agree and accept that CSIS may not have provided them with a course of action. When they knew that there was irregularities, why didn't they act? That's an outstanding question that still remains. So we will continue to push forward on this.
Okay, but you keep talking about red flags, willful blindness, not taking it seriously. Just as a final point, I mean, you have a final question on this. You have the capacity to make them take it seriously. So when will you let us know what the next tool will be in your toolbox on this?
As soon as we make that decision, we'll be letting folks know.
Okay, one decision you have made is you will take the Prime Minister up on his offer to view the confidential annex to the Special Rapporteur's report, to David Johnston's report, linking back to the raw intelligence. Why have you decided to view that, even if the consequence of that is you cannot speak to the specifics anymore and it could limit your ability to ask questions on this in question period?
I think a responsible thing for a leader of an opposition to do is to be able to look at that information and to make my own assessment of it. There are things that the Special Rapporteur said after having viewed that information and protecting confidentiality. He said unequivocally that the allegations against Hang Dong were not true, the ones that were raised by in the media. He made that finding and said that publicly. So I'll follow and adhere all the rules around what information can be shared and what can't be shared. I know that there will be some limitations because of it, but I think it's a responsible thing to do as a leader of an opposition party to look at that information and then to make my own assessment.
What do you make of the Conservatives' argument that this is essentially a trap and that it's an offer that would silence the opposition and stop them from being able to hold the government accountable on these points?
I think that does not sound like a leader that's interested in becoming Prime Minister. That's someone who is stuck in a closed-minded kind of view around what the responsibility and the seat of the importance of being an opposition leader. To be able to look at information, to be able to make an assessment that doesn't preclude the rest of my team from asking questions, and doesn't preclude the rest of my team from continuing to pursue different avenues of lines of questioning. I'll still be able to continue to hold the government to account as well. There will be limitations, and that's a part of being in a position of being an opposition leader. To be able to hear information, to receive information, and to be willing to do that is something that I think is a sign of leadership. And those that choose not to, I think, is a sign of a lack of leadership.
You're not alone in calling for a public inquiry, despite what David Johnston said in his reports today. But how do you get around his argument that, at least in terms of what the public is able to see, the Security of Information Act applies so strictly that there's not much more that can be revealed to the public beyond what was in his report? And even if you have a judge-led public inquiry, those same restrictions apply. It's a duplication of effort for no greater public understanding of the issue.
Well, I would push back on a couple of pieces. One is the independence of a judge making that determination is something that I think would give Canadians more confidence in terms of what is disclosed and what is not disclosed. The independence and separation of an independent judge, like we saw in the Brulot Commission, is something that I think would be more reassuring to Canadians. In addition, I point to the Emergencies Act public inquiry as a template. There was information, significant information, that could not be disclosed because it was of a national security interest. And then that information was not disclosed. But there was still a number of things that were disclosed through that public process that gave Canadians more confidence in the decision around calling for the Emergencies Act. That is something that we want to see happen. The fact that witnesses are compelled to appear, that there is a forum for asking those witnesses multiple questions. There's a cross-examination, if you will, of those witnesses, that all provides Canadians with that confidence that steps are being taken. The same limitations that applied in the Rouleau Commission would apply, and the same limitations that Mr. Johnson spoke about are important to recognize, and I accept those. I don't deny those in any way. It would undermine our national security if certain information was released. It would undermine our ability to keep ourselves safe. So we don't want that to be disclosed. But that doesn't preclude a lot of information coming forward that gives the Canadians and the public more confidence that this matter is being taken seriously, that the questions that need answered are being asked, and that there's a strong follow-up in terms of what we do next.